Welcome, everyone. Hag Sameach, happy Sukkot. Gut Moed, happy intermediate days of the festival. It's so exciting to see all of you from all over the place. A lot from Cleveland or areas around Cleveland, but also all over the country. And also I saw someone's from Paraguay. So that's cool. I think one of the blessings of Zoom is that we can both do something that's really grounded in Cleveland, but also connect with each other all over the country and the world. Sorry. So I'm Miriam Geronimus. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in my 5th year of rabbinical school. And I am growing a community in Cleveland. And this is our first event, co-sponsored with a lot of other people, but we're very excited to be doing this. I think of it as, a taste of what might be, and also a bit of an experiment. So I'll say more at the end, but really wanting to hear feedback from y'all after or at a later date. I have some co-facilitators today, so I'd like to ask Yoshi and then Jeremy to briefly introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, I am Yoshi Silverstein. It's really, really lovely to see everyone on here. I will invite those who don't have your cameras on to turn them on if you're feeling, in a spot where you feel comfortable to, but we will not be offended in the least if you keep them off. I'm the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective here in Cleveland. We're really, really delighted and honored to be partnering to host this event tonight with some other great organizations, what we'll talk about at the end. Really quickly, our mission is to build resilient community through embodied Jewish practice and racial justice. And so this is a really exciting opportunity for us to do work that is talking about there's not that many things more embodied than eating, right? Or if eating is not an embodied activity for you, you're kind of doing it wrong. There's like no other way to cut it. So we're really excited for this to have, learn some more about some methods that Jeremy's going to bring us with pickling, and then do some learning around how we can sort of bring all of our shared, diverse cultural heritages and backgrounds, particularly through foodways, which is a particularly nourishing way to do that. So great to be here. Thanks everyone. Jeremy, to you.
Hi everybody. My name is Jeremy Umansky. I'm a chef here in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm inside my delicatessen, Larder, which has nothing to do with lard. A larder is an above ground root cellar. A lot of vegans and vegetarians and people who keep kosher often inquire about that. So we like to put it out there up front. So I do a lot of work with Jewish foodways. They are the backbone, Eastern European Jewish foodways of our delicatessen here. Everything from fermentation to ancient styles of cured meats and fish, bread baking, and so on and so forth. So I'm really, really grateful all of you are here. I'm super excited to make some sweet, sweet, awesome pickles with you. And we'll have plenty of time to take your questions too. So you'll hear more from me in a little bit. And thanks, Rabbi Miriam and Yoshi.
Thank you, Yoshi and Jeremy. So I just want to acknowledge the weirdness that Zoom can be a little awkward, and also the blessing that it enables us to connect with so many people across the world, and it really increases access. So I invite you to really enter this Zoom room, to bring your full self here as much as possible. I know we all have lives as well, and some of us are feeding kids or doing other things, but as much as we're able to really be present in this moment, just like you would be if you were physically somewhere outside your house. And to help us ground, I'm just gonna have us take a moment to If you can, if it's comfortable for you and possible, feel your feet on the ground. Notice where they make that contact, and just close your eyes or lower your gaze and begin to just let the day roll off you. Whatever stresses may have been happening earlier today, you can pick them up later, but for now, you don't need to worry about them. We can take a big breath together. Breathe in and out. You can open your eyes when you're ready. So I'm going to put our agenda in the chat. It's already kind of been alluded to. We're currently in the welcome and framing portion. Soon we'll be getting into the pickling demonstration that Jeremy's going to do, and that's really going to be the bulk of our time together. And then we're going to have a little time for breakout group discussions before we close. I just want to say a few words about Sukkot before I hand it over to Jeremy. So as you may know, Sukkot is a harvest holiday. And 2,000 years ago, when the temple still stood in Jerusalem, the ancient Israelites would make pilgrimage to the temple during this holiday. And it was the end of the harvest season, and they were thanking God for sustaining them. And this was based in a core belief in the Torah that everything belongs to God. We're merely guests on this land, perhaps stewards. And this may or may not be how you understand God, or you may not even believe in God, but I think that it can be a powerful metaphor regardless. So I'm gonna put this question in the chat and throw it out to you, and you can just answer in the chat. What does this idea that the earth belongs to God, what can that teach us? Whether or not we want to think about it literally.
Are you asking for responses in the chat or?
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just because there's so many of us, chat would be great. Yeah, to take care of the land and treat it as holy. It's not ours to run or rule, but belongs to something larger. Yeah. That we're caretakers of the land. Yeah, you can keep answering if you want. But yeah, I think like those of you have already written in the chat, this is really about humility and gratitude and recognizing that we're part of something larger than each one of us. And yeah, that's totally fair. Thank you, Lauren, for lifting up that that you're struggling with this as an atheist. I really want to highlight that it's a particular language that uses the word God, but that I really think we can think about it expansively and metaphorically as the universe or as beyond humanity. But happy to discuss that more later. One last question to throw out to you is, well, what does this all have to do with making pickles? You can also throw some answers in the chat. The idea that that we're feeling gratitude and we're harvesting, and preserving food is an important part of the harvest process. We need to preserve the earth just as we need to preserve a pickle. Pickles are meant to be shared. Yeah. So I'm really thinking about the way, you can keep putting answers in the chat. I'm really thinking about the ways that pickling is about taking a food when it's in season and preserving it to eat later so that you can always be eating local food. Right now, we so often take food at the grocery store that was grown in Mexico or somewhere else in the world when it's in season there, but not here. But pickling enables us to eat more locally. And so in that way, it connects us to land and to place and to cycles of time, similar to the ancient Israelites when they celebrated Sukkot. So the last thing I want to say about Sukkot is, since it's a pilgrimage holiday, it's also about gathering people. It's about community. And Yoshi's going to talk more about this later, but I'm going to throw in the chat a quote from the Talmud, which says, "It is fitting for all Israel to sit in one sukkah. The only way the entire Jewish people could do this is by residing in a communal sukkah that does not belong to any one of them." So in the pickling demonstration, Jeremy's really going to be drawing from his own Ashkenazi heritage. But when we get to the breakout groups, we're going to have the chance to really create this big inclusive sukkah. There are so many Jewish cultural traditions, and we hold many identities in this Zoom room. And we really want you to bring all your identities to the table in that discussion, because food is deeply connected to identity and heritage, and to a sense of communal belonging. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy.
Hi, everybody. So I think, Miriam, thank you so much. And I think those are they're fascinating things to think about. And you and Yoshi and myself, we had a conversation where I explained to you my take on the cosmic significance of fermented foods. And I'll kind of lead in with that, because I think it's incredibly unifying as a concept and allows us to be in touch with forces greater than ourselves. I know there was a couple people that brought up, from an atheist standpoint, they couldn't comprehend something, or an agnostic standpoint. And Miriam and I have talked at length. Like, I fall on this kind of weird spectrum. And my philosophical take on fermentation puts the world and everything I don't know about into a context that I can reason with and understand. So granted, this is a little bigger than an 8-ounce jar, but an 8-ounce jar of fermented food, which, there we go. This is about 8 ounces of the carrot pickles we're going to be making. This has about 6 to 10 trillion organisms living in that jar. And if we multiply that out by a gallon, 128 US ounces, we end up with something we can hold in our hands that has more life forms in it than observable bodies, as documented by numerous space exploration agencies the world over. So you can hold a gallon of sauerkraut and literally hold the essence of creation in your hands, because things are being created in that jar, they're being destroyed in that jar. All the forces of physics are at work, from the strong and weak electromagnetic forces to gravity. And everything is happening here: chaos, destruction, birth, and joy. And you can hold that in your hands and realize that things are more or less infinite, even though they may be contained within something. And there's so much we don't know about what's going on around us, in life, in the world, in the cosmos, that it puts us in a relative place, at least me in a relative place, where I can reason and understand something. So I kind of like to start that with that as some food for thought. And anybody has any thoughts on that, please go ahead in the chat. I want to let you all know too, like as we're going, I'll do my best to keep up with things in the chat, and Yoshi and Miriam are going to help. If anybody has any questions as we're going along, please totally like, let's do it. Some things to note, no question is a stupid question. So even if you think it's ridiculous and you don't necessarily want to ask it in front of the group, I can reassure you I've had that question before and other people do. So please go ahead and ask it. No question stupid or irrelevant. So, so first and foremost, what is kind of fermentation and how does it fit into being Jewish, at least with, you know, any of our individual Jewish identities? And fermentation, very much, I look at it in reference throughout the Torah. We hear stories of different shepherds taking care of their flocks, whether they're individuals actually taking care of sheep or God or angels taking care of us here on this plane. It's a reoccurring theme. And fermentation, you are a shepherd. Your job is to create and maintain an environment that your flock, these microorganisms, these bacteria, are going to live in and thrive and reproduce and do what you want them to do. You have to do very little actual work to make a fermented food. Your job is to make sure the field is tidy and clean, and that all of the organisms you are cultivating have everything they need to thrive and survive. So, you know, those of you that have never done this before and may be intimidated by it, may be intimidated like, oh, am I going to poison myself, my family? You know, is it going to be a big stinky mess and this sort of thing? Well, no, you're not going to poison yourself. That's first and foremost. Because generally speaking, if a fermented food looks good, smells good, and tastes good, chances are it is good. Also, this is very different from canning or other types of preservation, where in canning you may have the risk of botulism coming about due to improper amounts of salt or acid and that sort of thing. But with fermentation, as long as you have a minimum amount of salt at a safe level, things should go good for you. There are a few specific things from time to time. If you're fermenting cucumbers, there's some enzymatic activity that can happen and soften your pickles and that sort of thing. But this is why we chose to do our kosher dill carrots that we do here at Larder. You don't have to worry about anything with it. I will let you know those come out fantastic every time we do them. You're gonna love them. And you're gonna be like, whoa, a kosher dill pickle isn't always a cucumber, because there's kosher dill tomatoes and kosher dill peppers and carrots and you name it, eggplant, and it's all fantastic. When we get into the pumpkin, I definitely will say, as your pumpkin ferments, should you choose to do it, it will definitely get funky and cheesy. So you may have some smells going on, but we'll kind of address that as we're going. And I'll also discuss some like tips and tricks, how to kind of contain some of that smell or mess that may happen. So I think the first and foremost thing that you need to realize when you ferment is things need to be clean. So I'm gonna wash my hands really quick. Give me just a sec. Okay, so your hands are clean. You're ready to go. What you wanna make sure too is that your fruits and vegetables, whatever you're gonna be working with, is clean. I've got these beautiful carrots right here that we got from one of our local farmers. They're all sorts of different colors. I've pre-washed these ahead of time. Anytime you cook for yourself or prepare food for yourself, make sure your work surfaces are clean, your tools are clean, and that your ingredients are clean. Just kind of keep in mind too, as we go through this, I'm going to be kind of doing a little bit of this and a little bit of this. I'll try not to make you dizzy, but I want you to kind of be able to see what I'm doing. It's also really handy to kind of organize what the French say your mise en place, like all your prep work. So if you kind of look over here next to me, I've got everything we need for tonight, kind of already there, ready to go, somewhat prepared, so it's easy to show you and to work with. So it always helps if you do that ahead of time and then dig right into everything. So for our kosher dill carrots, these are pretty simple. And Miriam, did you and Yoshi send out the recipes?
We did not. We'll send them out afterwards, and people can learn tonight and experiment yourselves tomorrow or at a later date.
Awesome.
There's also a question
Yeah.
from Samia if the things that you're pickling tonight will be available for purchase at Larder.
So we just broke in. Hi, Samia. Always great to see and hear you. We just broke into our kosher dill pickles. We just went through our cucumber stock. So the kosher dill pickles are in. We're going to make a really cool bread amino sauce. Think like soy sauce, but made from rye bread, with this nice Eastern European Ashkenazi tradition attached to it. You know, so you don't, the soy vey sauce, that's really cool stuff, but you can kind of make your own. So I have some of that available here. The pumpkin, not yet. We're just starting to get them in, but it's something you'll see soon enough. So, so yeah, should you not want to make any of these foods, or, you know, you decide it's not for you, you can come in here and just try them first and then dig in. So, you know, with fermentation too, get yourself a scale. You don't have to get one like this, but $15 at a store is going to get you a scale that you can work with, because it's best to do these things by weight. It's the most accurate, because we're going to be doing a little bit of math and working with percentages and this sort of thing. And from a food safety standpoint, the percentages are, it's pretty important that you get them accurate within a range of acceptability. So get a scale. They're inexpensive and you'll be a better cook for it. So there's that. So starting off with the kosher dill carrots, I mean, what makes something kosher dill, and why isn't it just a dill pickle? I'll kind of throw that out there for anybody. We'll give it a moment to see if anybody has an answer for that before I give you it as I understand it. I see the way it's made, kosher salt. Yeah, kosher salt definitely has something to do with it, which at the restaurant we don't use because by weight, kosher salt is very, very expensive compared to other salts. So from an economic standpoint, we don't use it, even though Food Network says to use it for everything you cook. As a chef, I feel it's has its place in koshering and maybe garnishing, but not actually the rest of cooking. Does it need to be blessed by our almost-Rabbi? I mean, sure, that would help. Jews are the ones that promoted it. So I see garlic here. So it's a combination of all these things. So it's a pickling tradition that came out of Eastern Europe and really made its own in the United States. In New York, of all places, of course, where most of our families came into through Ellis Island. So it's a tradition of, yes, using kosher salt or this curing or pickling salt, which actually has lime in it, which is an alkaline substance that will actually keep the pickles crisp over a long period of time. So they would use the kosher, that salt, lots of dill, lots of garlic, and eventually to everybody else, you know, Jews would just call them pickles, but everybody else was like, oh, that's the kosher dill pickle, because that's what all the Jewish delicatessens are serving. So that's definitely a gross oversimplification, but that's pretty much how it came to fruition. So, and, you know, for American Jews, this is like a flagship of your upbringing and foods that are served at the table. And the tradition and the history of it goes back centuries throughout Eastern Europe and other parts of, you know, the world for that matter too, in various ways. So, you know, if we look at the ingredients in a kosher dill pickle too, most of the base ingredients in terms of, you know, traditional with a cucumber, they're very hardy. Dill's a very hardy herb. It can withstand a frost or two in the fall. So it's around for a little longer. It produces a lot of seeds, which are flavorful. The pickling spice, which we're going to use in there, these are hard, hardy, warming spices. So when you preserve this in the fall, when the season's ending, and you eat it throughout the winter, these spices are very invigorating into your spirit and your body. They make you feel warm and fuzzy. A lot of pickling spices are the same we use in like apple pie mix and pumpkin pie mix. When you smell them, you just smell, it kind of smells like warm potpourri, like grandma's house. And it's just super comforting. So you have that aspect of it, you know, and using up the cucumbers, they're a good food, and you could grow a lot of them in season and then be able to put them up. So, you know, it's interesting. I've read various things about the evolution of the cucumber and its travels throughout the world, and it's believed they were in India. There's also some scholars out there that talk about the underclasses of people in the caste system in India, which Jews were kind of ranked out of that going back into antiquity, as we now know, like gypsy populations, whether that's a correct term or not these days, that went into Romania and the rest of Eastern Europe, all had roots as at one time either Jewish or these lower caste classifications in India. And it's believed through some of that migration that the cucumber ended up in Eastern Europe because that, for whatever reason, Jewish people really loved it and started preserving it. So, so if we get into actually the making of these pickles, it's pretty simple. And in the recipe, that when you see it, you know, I gave a couple different descriptors of what to do with your carrots, but don't waste your time peeling this. It's a waste of time. It's beautiful. There's a lot of nutrients in there. And if you have greens on them too, you can leave them on there. They're edible. They're delicious and flavorful. So one thing you want to do is, because we're going to be putting this into, you know, a mason jar, you do want to cut them so that they can kind of fit in there. If you have a bigger container or a larger amount, and look how gorgeous these carrots are. Is that stunning or what? If you have a larger container, like if you want to put up a 5-gallon bucket of these, which you easily can, you know, you don't have to cut them. So smaller ones we leave whole, but other ones cut into a shape that you like to eat, whether it's coins or spears or that sort of thing. I'm going to cut a couple more of these bigger ones. There we go. These are going to be nice pickle spears. And you see I've got some of these smaller ones here. I'm just going to leave them whole. So quite simply, you're going to be like, well, this is all there is to it. And the answer is yes. We're going to put these carrots in the jar so that they fit. And how many do you put in? As many as you can comfortably fit. As you're going to, things like your dill, you kind of want to pack a little bit of that in there. And your garlic, put some of this in here. And then also your pickling spice. Now, we always grind our pickling spice. You know, it's easier serving to guests at a restaurant if they don't have to pick out cloves and bits of bay leaf, and if it's all ground. How much pickling spice do you put in? Well, how much do you like? Same with the dill and the garlic. I have measurements in the recipes you're going to get, but no reason. The only thing you need to hold fast to is the amount of salt in here. So any other ingredient is highly variable based on your personal taste. So I'm just going to add a little bit of pickling spice. I probably put about a tablespoon in this jar. It is strong stuff, and you can put too much of that in, so keep that in mind. Add some more carrots and just pack them in there. Now, one thing to note on this jar, we like to use mason jars for this, A, because they're inexpensive, they're easy to replace, they're recyclable, all of that jazz. They last a long time, but they've got this ring here. This is kind of like a marker. You only want to fill the jar up to here, both with your vegetables that you're putting in here and the brine that we're going to put in here. So it's got this cool, like, built-in little measurement. And as we put the lid on, I'll also talk about what happens when things ferment and how the lid is advantageous in a mason jar. So early on, I mentioned that people would use this pickling salt, which has an alkaline in there, which acts to keep things crisp. And there's many things that can do that. Pickling salt, which is really expensive compared to other salts, but also things called tannins. Any red wine drinkers? You can raise your hand. You don't have to be ashamed. I'm not one. And someone says you can make your own pickling spice. You totally can. Acorns have tannins. Grape leaves have tannins. And I just picked some off the back of Larder. They grow all over the building here. Oak leaves have tannins. Cherry leaves have tannins. And tannins essentially act to help stabilize the cell structure of the food that you're making. A plant cell is filled with something called a vacuole. It's an empty space. And as things break down in the plant tissue, that vacuole can collapse. And that's when things get soft. So the tannins help fill those voids. So does salt water as things are pickling. And tannins actually work to boost it and contain it in there so it keeps things crisp. So I've got some of the grape leaves, and I'm going to put them in here too. And you can use oak leaves of any oak, white oak, red oak, pin oak. It doesn't matter. Cherry leaves and that sort of thing. Traditionally, people would use the leaves of different trees. Nowadays, we use, as I said, these altered salts, or if you have access to grape leaves. But you can go back to using some really cool traditional things, and you'd be like, look, my pickles have an oak tree in them. 1 or 2 crushed acorns would work really well too. You don't want to go too much on the tannins because, as I mentioned, red wine, if you ever drink that big, bold red wine, it just sucks all the moisture out of your mouth. It's very astringent. That's because of these tannins. So you don't want to necessarily bring that flavor to your pickles. You just want to use enough to help keep them crisp.
Jeremy, we had one question, or a couple about the pickling spice. One is they're related. Someone was asking, Laurel was asking if you all make your own pickling blend or you get a store-bought blend. And then also Tim is asking if you don't have any pickling spice on hand, what are some good alternatives? Maybe stuff that folks might have in a decently stocked spice cabinet already.
Sure. So we purchase, because we go through a ton of it, we purchase like pre-mixed pickling spice here, and the jars will say pickling spice on them. It's pretty standardized in terms of industry production with pickling spice. So from pickling spice to pickling spice, you may have slight differentiation of ingredients in terms of the ratio of what's in them, but the same core ingredients are going to be there. So if you want to make your own, you're looking for bay leaf, you're looking for chili, brown and or yellow mustard seeds, or even black mustard, clove, cinnamon. Some people put allspice berries in there, or even juniper berries. And I'm trying to see if there's anything else on this bottle that, and no, there's no ingredients listed. But those are the core of them. Some of them may have like dried rosemary or parsley in them, that sort of thing, or dried dill seed.
Coriander seeds also.
Yeah, coriander seed is super, super common, which is the seed from cilantro.
That tastes nothing like cilantro,
yeah.
for those of us who hate cilantro.
So, it's pretty easy to put your own together. And if you Google pickling spice, I'm sure you'll get a million, recipe suggestions for them. So pick one that you think is going to be good. Pepper, black pepper is always in there, some peppercorns. So, yeah.
There's also a question about if you can use sea salt.
Yeah, you can use sea salt. And in fact, high mineral sea salts are actually really good for pickling. They are very expensive though. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Like, I come from this standpoint as a restaurateur, and I produce a lot of these things. So these dollars and cents add up for me over the course of time in considerable amounts. So sea salts, especially those that are rich in magnesium, potassium, calcium. So they're going to have like magnesium chloride and potassium chloride and calcium chloride in them. These are all different than the sodium chloride salt that is table salt here. And they all act as electrolytes. Any Gatorade drinkers out there? So, these energy drink producers put these salts, these are all different types of salts, into the energy drinks because they help your muscles retain water. So in trace amounts in sea salt, they will help your pickles retain water. So I saw someone said some of their lacto ferments go limp on them. Try using a sea salt. Hopefully that'll help them stay crisp. you know, that's one thing you can go for. So, yeah, how we doing? Any other questions come in?
I think that's it for the moment.
All right. So now it's time to add our brine. We've got everything in here that we want to put in here. And here's one of the reasons that I prefer this very fine-grained, see, this is like sand, salt, is a lot of recipes will say you have to mix your brine ahead of time and use hot water and then allow it to dissolve and then ice it down to cool it. And that's just a waste of time and resources, and you don't need to do it. So first and foremost, you need to determine the weight of your jar. So hopefully you can, sorry, we were doing some bread production before. So you can see hopefully these numbers here. I tend to do everything in metric, and in the recipes that you're going to get, there's a little head note saying that while I work in metric, I converted everything to standard imperial measurements for everybody because we're all used to cups and pounds and ounces and all that. But so I have this scale. I'm going to tare the weight of the jar, meaning I'm putting the jar on here and I'm telling the scale to subtract the weight of this jar. Then I'm going to put my jar on here. This says I have 330 grams of food inside the jar. So I'm going to do a little math. Safe percentages for pickling. These are a couple things to think about. You can go as low as 2% salt by weight. We do our standard at 3%. It's even safer. If you go below 2% salt by weight, you risk either spoilage microbes or pathogenic microbes getting into your ferment and potentially sicking you. At 3% salt by weight, you pretty much ensure that, who knows, maybe you were the unlucky person that bought that package of carrots that was industrially produced and farmed that had the E. coli on it, which we hear about in the news all too often with all sorts of fruits and vegetables. You know, at 3% salt, that's the minimum that we feel is safe enough that is going to retard that E. coli or that salmonella, maybe not listeria. There's some super bugs out there that it may not, but it's the safest for you to be at. We also feel that it's a good flavor threshold. Some people think 3% salt is too much. That's a little too salty, and they do 2 or 2.5% salt by weight. But we feel 3% is great. Those of you that like half sours, any of you out there, you're horrible people. I'm joking. They've got their place. I'm a full sour kind of person. But full sours, they are either fermented for less time or more often they use more salt. Because more salt actually inhibits the lactobacillus, this group of bacteria that turns these foods sour and preserves them, even though they are salt tolerant. So half sours tend to have a little more salt in them and are fermented for less time. So, so the higher you go, the less sour your food will be and the more of a salt preserved item it'll be. You can go up to even 7% salt by weight and still have some amount of fermentation and souring happen in here. Because what happens is this lactobacillus, here's where you got to be a good steward. These bacteria are going to consume simple sugars found in the fruits and vegetables in here. And when they do that, they are going to, you ready for this? Poop and pee all over everything, lactic acid. And that's what makes it sour and preserves it. They actually metabolize it. They don't have an anus or any sphincters on their bodies. But poop and pee just kind of sounds fun. Think about that for a sec. Anyways, yeah, up to 7% salt, and you will still get some active fermentation on this. Once you get to 10% salt, you know, even 8% salt, then you have a salt preserved vegetable and not necessarily a fermented food. And that salt preserved vegetable, they do have a lot of use, and traditionally they were used in the days before refrigeration was widespread. Those foods would have to be desalinated. They'd have to be boiled or soaked in clean water, various changes, to leach a lot of the salt out of them, and then they could be used in cooking in various dishes. So 3% salt's a good way. So as I said, before my scale times out on me, I have 330 grams. So I hope this isn't backwards on here. 330 multiply by 3 and the percent key, or 0.03, and I get 9.9. So I need, and this is where you don't have to be 100% accurate, because we're using, at 3%, we're higher than the very minimum safe threshold. I can round to 10 and say I need 10 grams of salt in here. One thing I didn't do that I got ahead of myself with, because we'll redo the math, sorry, is I didn't add water to this. My bad, everybody. Okay, I'm glad I caught that before everybody else did and started saying, well, where's the water in the brine? Okay, so my jar is tared. I've added my water up to this line we talked about. We're gonna do the math now. Now I have 908 grams total. So 908 times 3%. And I need 27.24, 27 or 28 grams of salt added to this. And then I will have a proper salt solution to ferment this in. So, got another container here. I'm just gonna weigh out my salt. All right, so I have the salt here. And once again, this is why we like using fine grained salt, because I don't have to make a brine ahead of time and dissolve it. I just pour it in. We're gonna put a lid on here, fairly tight, and we're just gonna give it a few good shakes. And shake it for a minute or so, and it'll dissolve enough of the salt that you're ready to go. How's that jar of pickles look? So fermenting in this jar is very useful because you can see some bubbles up here a little bit from the shaking. If I twist the lid a little bit, it'll let some of that trapped air out. Now this 2-piece lid on a mason jar, it was designed for canning, yes, but it's also very practical for fermentation. A lot of people are going to try to sell you airlocks or special lids for these jars, weights and that sort of thing. One thing to keep in mind, and obviously it's not, I can't tip it too much because it'll spill. There are some ingredients above the brine level in here. Anything above the brine level in a jar or a bucket is going to mold. But using a sealed jar like this where there's very little headspace, our risk of these parts molding is slim to none, at least until we open the jar and start to dip into it and take things out of it. Now, this 2-piece lid is really nice too, because as things ferment, carbon dioxide is produced. These organisms, just like us, they bring in oxygen and they respire carbon dioxide. And when they do that, gas builds up. So if you just have the lid on, this is called finger tight. I can take like 2 fingers and just barely tighten it. Now this lid is on tight enough that little fingers in the house hopefully can't get in there, and pet hair and dander that's floating around and dust, it's not going to get in here. But as the microbes digest the sugars and produce lactic acid and carbon dioxide as a byproduct, that gas can leak out of here without this jar pressurizing. Now, sometimes the jar will still pressurize, and it's best when this is done fermenting in 7 to 10 days, just like this, sitting on your counter, preferably out of direct sunlight. It's ready to go. If the jar is pressurized, put it down in the sink and open it, and maybe kind of put a plastic bag or something over your hand, because when it's pressurized, it's like a shook up can of soda, and it could potentially go all over your kitchen. So, but if you leave this jar finger tight, you should be good. Another thing to keep in mind is, because this is fermenting and bubbling and things are coming up and gas is being pushed out, sometimes some of the liquid comes out. So while you're fermenting, keep it in something like this or a shallow pie pan, because if liquid comes up and bubbles out a little bit from time to time, it's all being caught in here and it's not going all over your counter. So About jars too. If you happen to use glass jars that are squared off and have edges on them, those are really bad for fermenting things in. They can't handle a lot of pressure and they can shatter and explode. So use a mason jar or a ball jar or a carrot jar, whatever brand you use is fine, but make sure it's rounded and doesn't have squared off, or it is an octagonal shape or hexagonal shape or anything like that. And you can do this in crocks and buckets and that sort of thing. You know, if you got a little bucket, what you have to make sure you do if you use an open bucket like this is you need to weigh down the ingredients so they stay under the brine. Because as we just discussed, anything poking up can mold. And if you're using a vat that's open and doesn't have a lid, you need to make sure things stay under. Let me grab an example here of how you can weigh it down. Bear with me for a sec. Okay, this thing's really heavy. So there are various companies that sell like specific fermentation weights that fit inside a bucket or a crock or whatever you're using. And you know, if you're using a bucket, make sure it's food grade plastic. Not all plastic is food grade. Or use glass or a wooden barrel, something that is non-reactive. Do not use like an old steel barrel or something like that, something that can rust, because the acid produced by the pickle and the liquid in there can cause metals and stuff to leach in, and you don't want to eat rusty pickles. So you can invest in these weights if you want. We don't. They're cumbersome, they're expensive. Instead, we go back to our cheap, inexpensive friend, salt. So this is a bag that I pushed in, and this is, we call this a Ukrainian amino paste. This is kind of like a miso, but it's made from vital wheat gluten and sunflower seeds and barley. 3 ingredients that Ukraine is known for producing on very large scales. So what we did is we pushed a bag in here. And then once we got everything under this brine, this liquid that's here, we left the bag open and filled it up with salt. And salt is very heavy. You can also do this with a bag of water, but salt is considerably more heavy and fills in better. Water has the limits of the bag, where salt can be kind of moved around and pushed around, and allow the bag to fit in here better. And then afterwards, this salt is salt, so you could use it for pickles. When you take this out, you can use it for your next round of pickles. This salt isn't going to go bad. So this is a way you can weigh things down if you're using a crock or a bucket that doesn't involve like these expensive weights and, you know, crock lids, which can get misplaced really easily.
Jeremy, someone had a question. Do you use distilled water or can you use normal tap water?
It depends where you live and what you're comfortable with. So here at the restaurant, we use Cleveland tap water. I've lived in the Hudson Valley and had well water before, and I've used that for pickling. And sometimes things would go off, but not very often. So it depends, you know, what you're comfortable with. You can use distilled, you can use tap, you can use reverse osmosis, Brita filters, whatever you want to use. But, you know, generally speaking here, we use tap for everything. So, yeah. All right. So we got 2 more ferments. We're going to go through this next one pretty quickly because it's very similar in almost every respect to the carrot, but it uses pumpkin. And this is like a spiced Litvack pumpkin pickle. I have this beautiful pumpkin. I just cut a wedge out of there. This one happens to be white. You can leave the skin on. This is a very thin skinned one. Ones with thicker skin, take it off. You could do this with acorn squash, whatever it may be. This one, I imagine, is what some Jews in Romania would make while they were making pastrami, because it's got either pine or spruce or juniper in it. Got black pepper in it. It's really bold. It would hold up to smoked meat dishes, which are traditional for a lot of Jews in that part of Europe. So for this, once again, you're going to cut it up however you want. We'll try cubes. And keep in mind, cut it into a shape you're going to enjoy eating, or a big enough shape that you can cut up to fit the needs of the dish you're going to use it for later. And really, it's about getting everything in the jar, making sure that you have the proper amount of brine in there. I'm using juniper because I didn't have any pine trees or spruce trees near me, but there was a nice juniper bush. This recipe, we're putting the grape leaves in again for some tannins. A little bit of black pepper. How much? Well, how spicy do you like it? I remember making gefilte fish with my grandmother every year once I became an adult and was allowed in the kitchen. And I'd always be like, oh, that's a lot of pepper in the gefilte fish. And she'd be like, no, it's not. And she'd throw a bunch more in. Juniper berries. And this recipe, I also put mustard seed in it, but I ran out earlier and I have to get more delivered tomorrow. So once again, we're going to weigh this out. We're going to add our water, figure out that 3% salt, and we're going to let it ferment. And, you know, we wanted you to see two different types of pickles with two different base ingredient sets, because it doesn't matter what you ferment. You can ferment anything and make a great pickle. And you can put whatever spices and seasonings you want in it, and it's going to be absolutely awesome. So, you know, have fun, explore, put your family's identity into the foods you eat and pass them on to the next generation. It's incredibly fascinating. So the last thing that we want to show you is, this is a little bit out of the wheelhouse for a lot of people. And this involves a magical mold called Koji. So we grow this mold here. This is grown on a mixture of rice and barley together. This mold is the underpinning of many, many fermented foods throughout Asia. Most often we use the Japanese terminology just because it's what a lot of us know comparatively. And if you've ever eaten miso or drank sake or had soy sauce, which I know every single person here tonight has some soy sauce in their house, you've eaten this mold. And what this mold does is it grows on a substrate, rice or barley, and it breaks down the proteins in there into tasty amino acids. Think MSG, but naturally produced. Very, very savory and tasty. And it breaks down the complex starches in here into fermentable sugars, which the bacteria in the ferment really like as a food source. And it breaks the fats down into fatty acids and esters, which, anybody ever eat a strawberry? Strawberries taste sweet and sour, but their flavor, which is aroma driven, is strawberry. So there's a difference there. Fatty acids and esters, fats, are responsible for these smells and aromas that give further flavor to our foods. So Koji does this really intensively over a very short period of time considerably. So I thought it'd be really cool to make something like a soy sauce, something that all of us have in our houses, but using some good old Jewish rye. And our Jewish rye here looks a bit different than like a traditional New York Jewish rye. This Jewish rye is much more influenced by the traditions of Eastern Europe. It has molasses in it. It also is spiced throughout, not just with caraway, but other spices. And it has a very high rye content comparatively. Jewish rye typically that we'd find at a deli in America is like maybe 3% rye, 5% at the most. This is 25%. So I put like 2 years into research making this bread before we opened. It's an intense bread. But you can take your favorite rye bread. And I know you're saying, oh, you just gave me a crash course in this Koji. And I will shamelessly plug my new book called Koji Alchemy, which you can purchase at your local bookstore or via various online retailers. And it has lots of information in there. Or you can simply go to an online retailer and you can type in Koji, Koji, and source what I grow here fairly inexpensively to use in this recipe. And you can have it within 2 days because it's the 21st century and it's the age of information and instant gratification. So, so for this sauce, really we just need rye bread, and it can be stale rye bread. It could be fresh rye bread. It could be bread crumbs. And we are going to mix this. And as we talked about, you're going to get some recipes with exact measurements. I'm going to mix this with some of this Koji. And this Koji is what's going to turn this simple bread and salt water into something that's deeply savory and umami and has all these caramelized, beautiful notes to it. And is just something that you're going to love. So I'm going to take some. Normally, we'd be weighing all this out and scaling it properly and all that, but we've got some other things to talk about tonight. So we're going to put it in there. We're going to add water to it. And this is water to cover it. I didn't do a good job of covering, but normally all this would need to be completely submerged in here. And then I think in this recipe, I'm looking here. Yes, we calculate 10% of the weight of all the ingredients in salt. And then you're going to cover this, and you're going to let this sit from anywhere from 3 months to a year. And this is where, you know, with the pickles, you're doing this. This took me 10 minutes to make, whether it's this 1 jar or 5 gallons. And then I'm going to sit and forget about it for a week to 10 days. You're doing very little work here, but your job is to be a good shepherd. So with this, you're going to let this sit anywhere from 3 months to a year. And once a day, you're going to mix it. And eventually over time, you're going to notice it go from this kind of opaque, kind of weird liquid into something that's super dark, much like the liquid on top of this stuff that I showed you. Eventually what's in your rye sauce is going to get this dark, just like a soy sauce. And you're going to have a fantastic condiment that you're going to be able to, if you did it now, in time for Pesach, you're going to have something that's fantastic to marinate your lamb shank in before you roast it for Seder. And it's going to be bold and umami, and it's going to be a bridge between seasons, and it's going to be delicious. And you're going to have this wonderful story to tell all your family. You're going to say, at Sukkot, this is what I did. And now at Pesach, as the new seasons are beginning and the new harvest is being planted, we are eating some of the old harvest, and we're completing this cycle from year to year. And it's going to be wonderful. Sorry for the quick crash course in using Koji, but it's that simple. And any of these techniques, before we turn it back over to Rabbi Miriam and to Yoshi, keep in mind, people have been doing this for thousands of years, since the dawn of agriculture, maybe even before. The archaeological record gets murky after a period because we just don't know where the archaeological record is exactly. We have to find it. So people have been doing this for a very long time with no access to the internet, no calculator, no exact measuring of ingredients and weights and that sort of thing. And people have survived on it. You have to think, most of us, myself included, I'm 37 years old. I had someone in my life, and I probably still do, people who grew up without electrified refrigeration in their homes. And they would have to rely on shelf-stable and fermented foods to feed themselves. We're not going that far back, maybe 70 years in some cases. So up until recently, everybody enjoyed these foods all the time. They made them at home, and they lived wonderful, safe, and lives filled with delicious foods. And you're here now because of fermented foods. There are some scholars that argue that being able to create these shelf-stable foods, because I don't know if we got any questions on like how long these pickles last after they're fermented. I have some ferments at my house that are going to be 15 years old next year that I just leave out and hang out. I've eaten a style of kimchi from the Koreas that was over 24 years old. These foods, they will keep changing and their textures will change, but they can last more or less indefinitely, as long as they're preserved properly. Once you like where it is, then you can refrigerate it, and that will kind of put the fermentation process in stasis and leave the flavor and the texture where you like it. But going back to, these can last forever. They're great foods. They're some things that you could make a batch of something and you could give it to your kids or your grandkids and tell a story about where you were at a specific time and place through sensory memory, using taste and aroma, and be able to tell this wonderful story that as soon as your family eats it, they're going to be transported to the time and place you were at when you made it, which is such a powerful thing. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I will give people my contact information too. I'm a little slow responding to email right now with all the craziness going on. But if you do decide that you're going to ferment and go ahead and make these foods and you have some questions, you can reach out to me. Also, Tuesday through Thursday at Larder from about 2 in the afternoon till 4:30 in the afternoon. Whether you have questions about fermentation or wild mushrooms or any of the other stuff we do here at Larder, stop in, bring me your jar of pickles and we'll look at it, we'll taste it together, and we'll put you at ease and let you know it's okay. Or the wild mushrooms you found in your backyard, we'll help you identify them so you don't kill anybody. So yeah, I'm around, and thank you guys so much.
Awesome, Jeremy. Thank you so much. Let me remove the spotlight, coming back in. So yeah, lots of thank yous coming in the chat, Jeremy, making sure you see all of those. So fascinating and interesting. Thank you again for sharing. And to let you all know, I don't know if you decided yet on a recipient, Jeremy, but we asked Jeremy, you know, what his normal teaching fees would be, and he's like, you know what, let's donate it to a local place in need. So which we're super happy to do. So for our final portion of the evening, I mean, one of the things, I mean, there's so much to love of what Jeremy was teaching us. You know, pickling, of course, is so much about this relationship to land and to place, and as you were just saying at the end, sort of like to memory, and like really a way to like preserve the memory of a place or of stories or of like the lands that we are in now or came from. It's also about building community. I mean, I was laughing to myself because you're talking about building a universe in the jar, and I was like, what if this injunction that we think about, you know, in like Jewish text about being fruitful and multiply, what if we got it all wrong and it was actually just about making pickles? You know, like lots and lots of pickles. So that was funny for me I laughed, you know, to myself for a good minute about that one. But it is definitely, I mean, I think, you know, if I mean, you can obviously make pickles and enjoy them yourself. And that's like, I think, a beautiful form of self-care. It's also a form of like giving yourself a gift, like in the future, right? You're doing it now, you can get it back in the future. And, you know, I think you're missing something if you're not also in some way using pickling as a way to connect with folks and to sort of be in community and build community together. So we're going to give a chance for folks tonight to do a little bit of community building and a little bit of learning together. So in the, whoops, hang on a second. There we go. All right, so in the chat, there should be a link to a PDF. I'm gonna give just a little bit of teaching and framing, and then we're gonna send everyone off into some breakout rooms for, it'll be, I don't know, 8 or 9 minutes at this point probably, but a chance for folks to just do a little learning together. So, you know, some of these things that we're thinking about, like I mentioned, we're thinking about, there we go. Thinking about, it's the holiday of Sukkot, and in Sukkot we're hearkening back to our a number of different areas of the sort of Jewish story. We're thinking about, but all of them are thinking about when we're in these times of transition, whether it's transition of being in the wilderness to like the ultimate, you know, the promised land, or the time of the harvest and transitioning into the winter season. All of these things we're thinking about, you know, the sukkah is about building a temporary space and sort of making ourselves a little bit more vulnerable to the elements. And that's also, you know, virtually what we're doing now. We're sort of creating a virtual space together here in some really neat ways. So okay. just seeing some notes there. Okay, so we're thinking about the relationship of land and place and embodiment, and we're thinking about food as this connection to place. And so some of these first sources here on the sheet, and I'm just going to talk through them briefly to just sort of set some context, and then I'll actually invite folks when they're in your breakouts to actually spend more time on the second page. So someone, I think, things are blurring together, but I think somebody said at the beginning, talking about, oh no, but I was thinking about a different Zoom call today, but somebody was talking about the, something, yeah, Sammy's laughing at me. So something that gets cited pretty commonly is this idea of being the ger, or the stranger, or the sojourner. And there's this phrase that's mentioned in the Torah and the Jewish Bible and Jewish text of remember that you were a ger, you, the people Israel, were ger in the land of Egypt. You were strangers, you were sojourners, you were marginalized. Remember that, and think about that when you're thinking about the ger in your community, like now, which is, referring to ancient Israel. That phrase, that basic iteration of remember that you were strangers yourselves, is said 36 times in text. It's in the Torah. It's the most commonly repeated phrase in the entire Torah. So it's something that I would posit that like a number of folks on this call have probably heard at least here and there a little bit. But what we talk about less is like, what's the flip side of being ger, right? And so as much as we're really thinking, what does it mean to be in diaspora, to be journeying, all of that, like, well, what happens when you're trying to really root yourself in a place? And so this word, the word for that is ezrach. And sometimes it's translated as citizen. But as you can see in some of these texts, ezrach and ger actually both have their linguistic roots in nature metaphors. And so ger is related to gergir, which is a berry that's fallen off of its tree, right? So it's like maybe a bird picked it up and it's traveling around and it's going and spreading the seed and growing. Ezrach is connected from Psalms to a robust native tree. And so there's really this sense with ezrach of like a rootedness in place and a rootedness in the land, and the way that you sort of are connected deeply and intimately to the land through like becoming or being ezrach. And so, I think as we'll then go into these next few texts, all of us, whether we have, I'm assuming we have folks from all different backgrounds who are on the Zoom tonight. We have folks who are Jewish, probably folks who are not Jewish, folks who come from like dual parent Jewish backgrounds and not Jews by choice, right? And we've also got Jews from all around the world that are on the call tonight. And so, we may have some folks on the call who do have, indigenous heritage to, Native American ties here. But I think most of us, again, just like demographically, assuming most of us or our families came from somewhere not this continent, right? So we're all thinking about what does it mean, or I'll put this question of what does it mean to like when and where do we feel like the ger, the stranger, the sojourner, and when and where do we feel like ezrach, and do we feel like we're rooted now or not? And if in some sense we want to become rooted, like how do we go about doing that, and how do we sort of cultivate a relationship that's both hearkening back to our different land and heritage and soul stories, and it's also here now. So with that, there's a couple texts, and these one's from a Jewish person and one's not, but they both contain a lot of really deep, what I would consider Torah wisdom. So we'll take about 8 minutes in breakout groups, which we might need a second to do that, because I think Miriam doesn't have that yet. Yeah, so take a look at the text on the second page. There's some discussion questions there. We'll come back then in about 8 minutes after and do a little bit of sharing back and then close up for the night. So let's see. All right. Cool. All right, I'm going to create the rooms. We will see you all back in about 8 minutes and enjoy your conversations.
Really focus on page 2.
Food and identity, food and memories, the resourcefulness of generations previous to us. Yeah. Memories are tied to food intentionally. Yeah, that's a nice thought of like, like there's the passive that we have these memories connected to food, and also say you have like, oh, I could create a memory by like incorporating the food of like, I want today to be special or whatever it is, like, or I want this to be memorable in some way, like let me add the food and add all these different like additional sensory experiences to sort of like lock in that memory. I love that. And then yeah, exploring as a Jew by choice, exploring the full diversity of Jewish cuisine. Yeah, great. So folks, definitely continue if you have other takeaways or thoughts or questions, like also if things that you're grappling with, if there's anything that, you know, maybe you're feeling challenged by, would love to see that in the chat as well. I think to say a brief word about these two things and to think about it. So we have the first text is from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and there are some notes on these sources at the bottom for those who want to just, you know, look back again. Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's an Indigenous American woman, Native American woman, and she's also an ethnobotanist. And so she really bridges beautifully these different sort of like ways of knowing and different sort of like areas of knowing. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is amazing. I just keep it on my nightstand, and like, it's like, I'll just like read a chapter, and it is like the most calming, because her language is just absolutely gorgeous, and it's really interesting, fascinating stuff, but it just like calms me immediately. And so she's really talking about this question, you know, yeah, like what does it mean to indigenize ourselves or become like, make ourselves native to a place? Like, can we? I don't know, but like, it seems like to me, it's like a really worthwhile goal is to figure that. Like, I think that's a really important question. That I think everyone in some way should be asking. And I think, you know, for folks who are Jewish or connected to Jewish community, like we have this history of thousands of years of diaspora, of like blending with different places, and sort of, and the food has been one of these really classic ways which we sort of, we get used to the food, and then we just like layer Jewish symbolism and metaphor and ideas on it. Like that's how latkes became Jewish, right? Is that like, they're actually just a staple of Eastern European cuisine. And then we're like, oh, and we fry them, hey, Hanukkah, right? So it's like, but there's no reason that, so like I'm Chinese, there's no reason that we couldn't also have, you know, scallion pancakes for Hanukkah. Like that's all, you know, like, I mean, honestly, if you can't think of a few other, you know, fried foods from around the world, you're really not trying very hard, right? So like, there's all sorts of ways, and it becomes really fun and delicious to bring in different foods and into our Jewish holidays and to the Shabbat table and etc. And then of course the second from Michael Twitty, who is Black and Jewish and a Jew by choice, and again is talking about diaspora and memory and connection to food and all of these things. So I think I'll turn it back over to almost-Rabbi Miriam, and you know, I think the last thing I'll say is that, you know, what's really been on my mind and thinking of this, one of the early texts talking about how you know, you can that you don't have to be in your own private sukkah to say the blessing of the holiday, that actually there's this like communal value to it, and it's almost like leading towards, we'd rather have the communal than just the private. And so to me, a lot of, and this is both personally and the work we do through Mitsui Collective, is thinking about what does that sukkah look like in terms of making it big enough and open enough to really welcome in the full community, right? And then especially when we're talking about food, like what's the food that goes on the table, and is that food representative of like all of the different foodways and the different heritages that we're bringing in as this like really amazing, vibrant, diverse Jewish people. So with that, Rabbi Miriam, almost-Rabbi Miriam. Okay, just call you Rabbi Miriam, so close enough. Back to you.
Thank you. I love that. I mean, I gave this title to myself, but I love that I'm now almost-Rabbi Miriam. Has a funny ring to it, but it's accurate. So yeah, I just want to thank all of you for being with us tonight. If you want to take a moment and just type in the chat a word about how you're feeling after our evening together.
And as we're doing that, I want to make sure we thank our I don't know if y'all are sponsors or partners, or maybe a little bit of both. Our friends at Jewish Liquid Alliance and Bend the Art Cleveland, who are also part of the team that helped us put this together. Really thankful to be in community with all of you.
Yes, absolutely. I'll put a little plug for myself, and then invite Samia and Tim to give a little plug for Bend the Arc and Jewish Liquid Alliance. So if you weren't here at the beginning, I'm in my 5th and final year of rabbinical school, and I'm growing a new community here in Cleveland. So this was our first event, very exciting. And I want to build this together. So if you're a Cleveland person, I would love any feedback you had about this event. I'll be following up with emails and would love to get to know all of you better. And I'll also, regardless of where you live in the world, you'll be getting an email with the recipes and the recording, so you can, there was a lot I know tonight, and a lot of rich information from Jeremy, and you don't have to remember it all. You'll have resources. Yeah, so that's what I have. And Samia, do you want to say a word?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Samia. I am one of the local community organizers for Bend the Art Cleveland. We're pretty new to Cleveland. We've been here about a year, and we are doing organizing with progressive Jews all around the city, trying to build our voice and do some political action. We are doing phone banking for the upcoming presidential election. We've endorsed a Senate candidate in Cincinnati, and we have an anti-racism training for Jews next Wednesday at 8 o'clock. It's going to be really excellent. I encourage you all to check it out. Find us on Facebook. Reach out to me if you'd like to get connected. And yeah, thank you all for being a part of this.
And Tim, do you want to say a word?
Yeah, I was just putting in an email address into the chat. Jewish Sacred Alliance is going to be 4 years old this October, and we're basically a community organization that just says, hey, we're Jewish and we're West Side. We do have members from both sides of the river, and even other states at the moment. But basically, we're just two things. We're visibility and community. We usually do have a Sukkot program, but because of COVID, we're everywhere and building collaboration. So we couldn't be happier to sponsor this program. And also unrelated, but will probably be shared in the emails that you can join. I'm going to put the email link in the chat if you want to join our mailing list. I'll be co-leading the anti-racist presentation next week. So yeah, email any questions and look us up on Facebook.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so thank you everyone for hanging out with us till the very end, and Chag Sameach, happy Sukkot.
Chag Sameach, and thank you, Jeremy, of course, again.
Yes, of course. The
Yeah.
real reason to come tonight.
Thank you.
Amazing. Cool. Moadim l'simcha, everyone. May it be a time of great joy as we finish out the holiday of Sukkot. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Good night.